Hi, everyone. My name is Levi. We're going to start the official event this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to see so many people here early, and thank you for coming to the social. Um, this is one of Echo Action Arlington's series of events related to trees and plants and pollinators. We have a couple, and this is a really fantastic one. We're really excited that you're joining us for Plight of the Pollinator. We have some terrific speakers, and just to let you know, this session is being recorded, and we have a couple other housekeeping things we want to cover first. First of all, thank you so much to our sponsors, which include Amazon, JBG Smith, and Faro and Faro Graphic Communication. We also just wanted to let you know that on our website, you can find our upcoming events. We have quite a few in the series, as well as our Earth Day cleanup, our annual meeting, and it concludes with our Echo Extravaganza, followed by our Green Home and Garden Tour. My name is Levi Novi, and I'm a board member of Echo Action Arlington. Tonight, we're going to hear from two speakers. They are each going to provide their presentations, which will be about 20 minutes each. And then we'll have about 15 minutes for question and answer. You can put your questions in the chat throughout the presentations, and we'll do our best to get to them at the end. So we're really excited to have Celia Vuocolo, who is a private lands biologist with Quail Forever and the Natural Resources Conservation Service, is one of our speakers tonight. In her work, she works with private landowners in Northern Virginia to help them figure out the best ways to protect wildlife on their lands. We also have Sam Droege with us. He is a wildlife biologist with the United States Geological Survey. And among his accomplishments, he's worked with amphibians, with birds, all kinds of wildlife. But the reason that we have Sam and Celia here with us tonight is to talk about pollinators, which they both love. And they also are both going to give us some great tips on how we can help pollinators. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Celia.
Thanks so much for having me tonight. I can tell we've got some great enthusiasm for this topic, which I greatly appreciate. My goal for this talk is to really leave you all feeling inspired and motivated to help support our local pollinators. I'm going to start with some just basic information about pollinator biology and conservation threats, and then highlight two groups of bees that I feel are the greatest conservation need in Virginia. I'm going to close out my section with 6 tips for creating pollinator habitat for gardening pollinator habitat. And then I'm going to also talk a little bit about what you can do if you're short on space. And then I'm going to hand things over to Sam. So Levi already did a great job introducing me, but I just want to provide you with a little bit more of an overview. So I've been in this position for about a year, but prior to being the private lands biologist for Northeast Virginia, I also worked for the Piedmont Environmental Council. Some of you may be familiar with their work. And I ran their wildlife habitat program for about 8 years. You'll notice that I have 3 logos here on the screen. I'm what is referred to as a partner biologist. And essentially what that means is, I work for Quail Forever, which is the arm of the national nonprofit group Pheasants Forever, which is dedicated to conserving upland habitat. But the Natural Resources Conservation Service and Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources also provide financial support for my position. So hope you caught all that. So we now have 6 private lands biologists in Virginia, which is the most biologists we ever had. So it's an exciting time. We are known affectionately as the quail biologist, but we do much more than quail, which is why I'm here tonight. I cover 18 counties, which you can see delineated here in white on the map. And as Levi mentioned, I primarily work with private landowners who are interested in learning how to better manage their land for these upland species, bobwhite quail, as I mentioned, native pollinators, and grassland birds. So much of what I do is focused on promoting biodiversity, and insects are a large part of what makes the fabric of our grasslands so rich and diverse. Our ecosystems rely on food webs that are supported by insects. Insects take part in nutrient cycling, the food cycle, population control, and of course, pollination. The vast majority of plants on Earth rely on animal pollinators to reproduce, and the majority of those pollinators are insects. We need plants for a variety of important reasons like carbon sequestration, maintaining soil health, which we've already talked about a little bit tonight, clean air, food for ourselves and animals, and the list goes on. Native plants are the backbones of healthy ecosystems. I'm sure that many of you are aware of the multitude of threats that are facing our insect pollinators, but I just wanted to highlight our four main ones. So you'll see here on the slide of a microscopic photograph of the bee gut parasite known as Nosema, that's its genus. It's driving the decline of several of our bumblebee species, including the federally endangered rusty patch bumblebee. Aside from pathogens, pesticides, of course, if they don't outright kill the bees, suppress their immune systems, making them more susceptible to illness. Climate change also provides challenges to insect pollinators, and I'll highlight this in two ways. First, like other animals, bees have thresholds when it comes to temperature tolerance. And what we're seeing are range shifts occurring as our world warms. Specifically, bumblebees in particular are moving northward and higher up in elevation to essentially escape the heat. Additionally, warming temperatures cause flowers to perhaps bloom earlier. I mean, it was almost 80 degrees the other day in Northern Virginia. And it also is causing bees to emerge earlier. And what can happen there is we can start seeing phenology gaps. And I'm going to get into that a little bit later. And of course, the effects of habitat loss are huge. And habitat loss is not always what people think. For a bee or a butterfly, an over-manicured lawn with no flowers where there once was a field or forest is habitat loss. And in the US, we have a lot of that. 50 million acres to be exact. Lawns are the fourth largest crop in our country, and we spend a lot of time, money, and effort keeping it up. So bees and other insect pollinators require pollen and nectar to survive, something that lawn cannot give them. Pollination is simply the act of moving the plant's genetic material to its appropriate sexual organ so that it can reproduce. It's really as simple as that. Pollen is also a really interesting substance. Obviously it contains the genetic material of the mother plant, of course, but it also is made up of fatty lipids, amino acids, and other nutrients that are highly nutritious to pollinators. And pollen also comes in different sizes and shapes, as you can see here on the slide, depending on what the plant species is. And some plants obviously need the help of animals to move their genetic material for them. The most efficient pollinators are the ones that are actively collecting pollen to feed to their young, and the act of which accidentally transfers pollen to other flowers during their foraging journey, which essentially results in pollination. So in North America, our pollinators are primarily insects other than hummingbirds, and then we've got some bats in the Southwest that also act as pollinators. I've highlighted bees here because I consider them to be the workhorses of the pollinator world, and obviously they're the topic of this presentation. So here's a couple of quick bee facts, as I like to call them. There's about 4,000 species of bees in North America, 20,000 plus worldwide. And then we have over 460 bee species that have been recorded in Virginia. In the greater Northern Virginia region, we have a great diversity of bee species, which includes the rusty patch bumblebee, as I already mentioned, which is one of 9 federally endangered bee species. 7 of those are all in Hawaii. And then we have the Franklin's bumblebee, which is only found in the Pacific Northwest. We have 5 groups of families or bees, groups of bees, bee families in the Commonwealth. It's a tongue twister. With the exception of the honeybee, which is native to Europe, and bumblebees, the majority of our Virginia bees are solitary, which means that they do not form hives or colonies. A female bee simply lays her egg in whatever the species' chosen nesting site is, depending on what their preference is, provides it with the food provisions, and then seals the chamber off and moves on. Because they do not have a nest to defend, solitary bees tend to not be aggressive. These are some locally collected bee specimens that I felt really showcase the diversity of body size, shape, and color of bees in our area. And through the growing season, which, in Virginia is arguably April to November, these bees are emerging, mating, overwintering, laying eggs, dying off. And there are some bee species in this photo whose life cycles will never overlap with the other. There are certain groups of native bees that are either at higher risk of extinction due to their specific foraging preferences or are just suffering massive population declines. Bumblebees are in this last group. The term specialist bee is basically just a way of describing certain bee species which can exist across all families of bees that are pollen specialists. And you'll notice here that I have everybody listed because, as I'm sure Sam is going to highlight, native bees in general are wildly understudied. There may be species in even greater peril than bumblebees or specialist bees. We just don't have the data to know. So I want to take you back in time a little bit, 100 million years ago to be exact. This is when bees split off from wasps when they were beginning to specialize feeding pollen and nectar to their larvae, as opposed to feeding insect prey, which is a wasp behavior trait. And then from there, bees began to diversify around the same time that flowering plants did, which you can kind of see, that's the gray funnel here on the left side of the chart. There is a direct link between flowering plant evolution and bee evolution, meaning that we think they drove the evolution of each other's physical characteristics. What this boils down to is, over time, flowers have developed strategies to better help their reproductive cause, essentially. So some flowers have developed traits like offering copious amounts of nectar, or being a certain color, or maybe having a certain shape that restricts what pollinators can visit so that only the most efficient pollinators can collect their pollen, things like that. Some of these plant-pollinator relationships became so specific that pollen specialism evolved. These bees only collect pollen from certain plants, and some are so specific that they may only collect pollen from one or two species. Their life cycle is timed with the life cycle of these plants, and if their host plant is not present in an area, they won't be either. And we have about 75 species of specialist bees in the mid-Atlantic, and they're at some of the highest risk of extinction of all the bee species due to effects from habitat loss and climate change, which can alter the bloom time of their host plants. I always recommend that folks who are interested in supporting pollinators consider plants that support specialist bees. If you're wondering which plants those are, you can take a look at the paper that I have up here on the slide. That was published by Sam and Jared Fowler. It's a really great resource for getting lists of those plants. Bumblebees are very near and dear to my heart, as I spent some time researching them in graduate school. They are some of our most gregarious and hardworking bees, but are also at some of the highest risk of extinction. We have about 11 bumblebees in Virginia, and there are 49 species found throughout all of North America. In Virginia, our earliest bumblebees, bumblebee queens, usually start to emerge around the second week in April. And they get to work immediately foraging on trees like redbud, and then some of those early forest flowers like Virginia bluebell and Dutchman's breeches. By October, new queens have gone into hibernation just a few inches below the ground. And the underground colony that the spring queens had been building all summer, that contained the female workers and the male bees, has died off. So their colonies are seasonal and only the new queens last until the next season. Bumblebees are facing numerous problems, and I kind of touched on this earlier, but specifically what we are seeing is that some species seem to be really susceptible to gut parasites, the nosema parasite, as I mentioned earlier, other pathogens, and of course, pesticide use. The American bumblebee, the yellow bumblebee, and the black and gold bumblebee have been experiencing precipitous declines over the past few decades, but are not yet on the endangered species list. However, the American bumblebee was recently proposed for listing under the Endangered Species Act. I believe it was in the fall, following a petition by several environmental groups that compelled the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to begin assessing the conservation status of the species. And this is why we are looking at this bee for listing. It has declined by about 89% across its entire region just over the past 20 years. Pretty substantial drop. And the rusty patch bumblebee, which I've already mentioned a few times, but I wanted to highlight this species in Virginia. So this is our first bumblebee that was ever listed under the ESA, which is back in 2017. And before a citizen scientist from the Virginia Working Landscapes Program, which is a program of the Smithsonian, found one during just a routine survey at Sky Meadows State Park. Some of you may be familiar, it's in northern Fauquier County. We thought this bee was extirpated from the mid-Atlantic. So that finding was pretty historic. And although we weren't able to locate any other specimens at Sky Meadows, and I was part of that survey effort, the Department of Conservation and Recreation has found more bees, rusty patch bumblebees, out in the western part of the state. So these are in the more kind of mountainous counties of like Highland and Bath and that region. So the best thing that you can do to help pollinators, other than altering or ceasing your pesticide use, is to create habitat. And building habitat for pollinators is relatively straightforward, but there are some planning involved, and you want to follow a couple simple guidelines. Pollinators really need a diverse set of flowering plants as well as places to nest. And a lot of times those two things can coexist very easily in the same wild space. And don't think of managing for pollinators in just one part of your property, because they actually will be using everything if the habitat is there. They really prefer a diversity of different habitat types. For example, early spring bees will be primarily in the forest along with some of your fields and gardens. And then bees during all parts of the growing season are going to be using a variety of habitats for nesting sites, but messy areas that have dead wood or hollow trees, just undisturbed soil areas, are ideal for them. Usually these are hedgerows or kind of shrubby areas that usually naturally have these features. So these are my 6 tips for creating pollinator habitat, and the big takeaway here is to plant Virginia natives and to be a messy gardener. This is the same advice I give folks that want to manage large tracts of land for bobwhite quail. Wildlife, generally speaking, like things a little bit wild and messy because that increases plant diversity and different kinds of habitat, and for bees, nesting habitat in particular. The majority of solitary bees nest in the ground, and the rest use dead standing stems and branches. So it's important to leave the leaves if you can and save the snags. At the very least, try to plant a suite of native plants that bloom from early spring to fall. And that way pollinators have something to eat all season long. Make sure to incorporate trees and shrubs because they are some of our first native plants that flower in the spring, and they are also host plants to many species of our butterflies. This is also, as you're thinking about what suite of plants you want to put into the landscape, where you can start getting more specific about gardening for specialist bees and bumblebees, and you can select plants that they may like and enjoy. Selecting a diversity of flower shape and color is really important. And that kind of harkens back to that slide I showed you on bee and flowering plant evolution. You know, the more diversity of flower types you have, the more diversity of bees you're going to support. Oops. I think that one's slightly, yeah, that one was slightly out of order. I was supposed to go after this one. I'm going to close out this presentation with just a couple of notes on gardening for pollinators when you're short on space. One of the things I love about pollinators is that you don't need a lot of space to make a difference. And that's not the case for a lot of wildlife species. I used to live in a townhouse in Bristow, and I got really thrifty on what plants I could use. And I had to use a lot of containers. You know, but growing native plants in containers is surprisingly easy and provides plenty of useful foraging opportunities. So the bees will come there. I would highly suggest checking out the Plant Nova Natives website. They actually have a resource that's specifically for container gardening, and it offers different ideas for species and just various gardening tips. So in a nutshell, you know, try to select plants for containers that do not have deep root systems and also like well-drained soil. Don't make the same mistake I did, which was sticking native warm season grass, which was little blue stem, in this orange pot you see here in the picture. It survived, but when I went to transplant it into the ground, the roots had just kind of wrapped themselves around the inside of the pot. That's because a lot of our native grasses have extremely long root systems, and some of our flowers do as well. You know, native grasses 5 to 8 to 10 feet long, so avoid them in containers. So the plants I have listed here are just an example of some natives that I found will do well in containers, but there's a lot more out there. You know, if you're planting in a garden bed, so not containers, but garden bed, be cautious of strong-shouldered plants that like to take up a lot of space. These are typically, but not always the case, but typically species that are found in our native grasslands and meadows like goldenrods and mountain mint and bee balm, and they need a lot of space. Try not to overcrowd your garden and try to stick with having at least one plant that blooms per season. This is an example of my backyard at the townhouse. And as you can see, I did a little bit of guerrilla gardening along the edge of this ragtag bit of forest that was back there. And this is where I chose to put some of the more strong-shouldered plants like milkweed and goldenrod, because that's the kind of environment that they would do well in. However, in my backyard, it's much smaller, shadier, tighter spaces. So I stuck with using woodland perennials, which were also pretty well behaved in smaller spaces. Sometimes I have to say I do miss these little gardens, even though my family and I have moved on to a larger property. I still miss and hope that they are doing well. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Sam. Give me one second.
Thanks so much, Celia.
You're welcome.
That was fantastic. I have a lot of questions myself, but I just wanted to remind everyone else that if you have questions too, please put them in the chat so that we can ask them all at the end. I'm still kind of blown away with the concept that most bees are solitary. I didn't know that. So thank you for that bit of knowledge, as well as all the other fascinating information you shared. We'll now pass it on to Sam.
Thanks. I'm going to just go right to sharing my screen. I'm going to show this at the end. I don't know what that long PDF thing is at the bottom, but if you ever have any interest in following up on anything I mentioned, you can email me. There's my email address. It's easy to find. Additionally, all of our photos that you'll see here are public domain, and we really encourage people just to grab them. You don't have to ask permission. I really don't even want you to, because we're going to say yes. And so we'll talk about a bumblebee project that everyone can participate in. It's non-lethal. It'll really make a contribution. And I'll talk about a few things that will augment what Celia said. So first, we just ended on this. Actually, Levi, you mentioned this. So you were surprised to hear that most bees were solitary. That's because our model bee is the honeybee. So the honeybee is so incredibly different from our native bees that the easiest way to talk about the differences between honeybees and native bees is say that anything you know about honeybees, you need to forget, because none of that exists in native bees. So we don't have multi-year queens, we don't have allergic reactions, we don't have barbed stings, we don't have honey, we don't have large colonies. The closest we get are bumblebees, and they don't have large colonies, maybe 300 are produced a year versus a quarter of a million in a good hive. So they're very different. I also want to point out, because this comes up all the time because of general confusion, honeybees have a very different and separate set of issues associated with their populations. It has to do with introduced pests. Native bees don't have those same set of pests in large extent, and their issues are habitat, as Celia has mentioned, and introducing honeybees to our environments, of which there are many people doing that within Arlington, it doesn't matter, Washington, D.C., is a ecological negative because they are competing for resources that the native bees would normally fill. So it's something to think about if you're harboring or asking people or working on honeybee, introducing hives to anything, rooftops, whatever. The issue should be, I love honeybees, they're super cool, they produce honey. It should not be, I'm saving bees, I'm saving the environment, and I'm doing a good thing for conservation. That is not the case. We can chat about that later. So I'm going to move on, and I'm going to show a map of PG County and Great Britain. And so the point here is, in little old PG County, there are more bee species present than there are in all of Great Britain. And this is just to illustrate that the region has a great deal of bee biodiversity compared to, say, continental Europe even. And so one county, so PG County, for example, fairly urban county too. It also, I should mention, is where I live and work. So it, it accumulates much quicker. And I'll point out a couple more cases where a urban environment such as Arlington has a really high population of rare and uncommon bees in the nearby parks, and those don't know boundaries. They're not redlining Arlington, like, oh, we can't go in Arlington because that neighborhood is just bad for us. No, you plant the right things and those bees will come. So an example of how much contribution just a single clump, a single flower in some ways can make. Remember, bees are small, so it doesn't take much energy, i.e. pollen, to produce a new bee. So all baby bees need some pollen, some nectar mixed together for protein and sugar, to simplify that. If we look at protein, so that's the thing that is usually in shortest supply, that would be provided by pollen. If we look at one annual sunflower, so this is the kind of thing you can go buy a bag of birdseed and plant this stuff. One sunflower can support literally hundreds of baby bees, producing so much pollen. And it's a favorite. It's a native of North America. And there's even bees that specialize only on sunflowers. And those bees will show up in the middle of suburbia too. So it doesn't take much. So you don't have to flip your entire lawn. I would suggest that you do that. But of course, just having one potted plant, or just a little, like anybody can plant a sunflower seed, is a great contribution. So it doesn't take much. And think of your home and or just your balcony as part of this larger landscape that you're now giving back to. Remember, your house at one point was great habitat at some point in history. It is not any longer. So this is reparations for damages done, if we want to think of it like that. So another aspect that I really want to encourage people to think about is that there is this tight relationship, as Celia mentioned, between native plants and native bees. Some are only going to one species of native plant. And therefore, when you think about planting plants for native bees, it's all about diversity, right? Because each plant species is really looking to have a small list of bees do the pollen and nectar gathering from it, and it deflects in a various plant sort of ways other bee species. Each bee species, on the other hand, is only looking for certain kinds of plants too. So what that means is that you can't just clover your way out of this problem, right? Because some bees will turn their nose up at clover pollen, like we'll never ever use it. And others are, more than happy, like bumblebees sometimes are more than happy to use clover pollen. So a diversity of native plants. It's not to say that non-native plants can't make a contribution, but they're mostly, I would call them bird feeder plants. So mostly non-native plants are feeding your crow and sparrow bees that are pretty much happy with everything. So those specialized bees that were mentioned earlier are the key to conservation, because you have to have certain plants. Those are going to be native in order for them to persist. So a diversity of plants. I think I'm going to show a website. I can't remember if I put it in there, where you can look these things up. Now I'm just going to do a little picture show. So I just want you to look at the forms. You know these forms, right? Because we know plants, we don't really know bees. So I'm not going to go into all the bee species details, of which they're lovely, and I spend all my day. I just want you to look at all these different colors, sizes, and shapes. You know they bloom at different times of day, different times of year, all that magical color and architecture. It's all about this specialization, right? So we don't have to know the details. We just can look at these plants and go like, that's crazy. What are you trying to do? The answer, we want certain kinds of pollinators, IEBs mostly, and we want to avoid or deflect or poison in some cases, because they often are putting in secondary compounds that are repellent or actual poisons to other bees. So we can do, and people have done these simple experiments. Well, they'll take a pollen load in a nest from bee species 1, and a pollen load from a nest in bee species 2, swap them, or swap them within species. So if you swap within a species, no problem, right? The baby bees grow. Swap among species, all the baby bees are dead. Why? Because certain pollen is very important to certain species, so much so it's not just like, I'm not eating broccoli. It's like, you just killed me by feeding me broccoli. So more diversity of plants, the better. And because we tend to, if you just go to Native Plant Society sales and things like that, we tend to focus on certain common plants. Those are not bad, but I am saying the more sophisticated conservationist backyard person should be looking to some of the less commonly planted native plants to create this more complete, what is the name of that? Charcuterie board of pollen. I just learned that name recently, so I'm very happy that I'm sophisticated enough to know what a charcuterie board is. So you want the charcuterie board of pollen producing plants in the neighborhood, not just Cheese Whiz. Ooh, I'm going to use that again in my next talk. Oh, here's this website. So it's the same as the paper, but it's updated, with new information as it comes in, as who is using what, because we know so little. If someone wants to grab, or you can look up Fowler and Droege specialist bees on the web and put it in the chat for people to copy and paste, that'd be great. But I'll point out that bees that use that specialize on plants, those plants are not rare, right? Because that system doesn't work. If you specialize on a rare plant and that plant becomes so rare that it's gone from the area, end of story, right? So these are things like blueberries, cacti, a variety of things, sunflowers, asters, I can see on there, willow. These are things that are around. So start here, because these are the bees that have the greatest problem. So I'm going to take a little break here, and I'm going to talk about how you can help with us figuring out which things to plant. So bumblebees. So here's, I believe it is the actual American bumblebee. I could be wrong about that one. That might be Fervidus. Ugh, I should know. But anyway, bumblebees are generalists. They come out, they'll be coming out in the next few days. A few might have come out in that last warm break, and they are going to be there through October. They can't be picky, right? Because they have to be picking up pollen from a wide variety of plants. They're generalists, but they have preferences too. And so when we talk about how do we support bumblebees, it actually is not a well answered question. We see bumblebees on certain plants, and plant landscape and particularly seed people are like, oh, well, people want bumblebee plants. Well, we can put together that list. That list often doesn't reflect well what actually bumblebees use. So we have a very simple program. Email us. I'll show you an email in a second, and that we developed last year. And we will tell you how to participate. And you know what? We love people's gardens and also public parks and also arboretums and places like Glenmont, where we're doing this too, because we want to have a plant-rich area with lots of different kind of bloom of lots of different kinds of plants, so that the plants are competing for the bumblebees, right? So if you want to know what's the favorite bumblebee plant, you have to ask the bumblebee in a place where there's lots of, opportunities. So you have a species rich thing. It turns out, well, bumblebees are going to be only on a small subset of those plants. So we did over 100 or roughly 100 surveys, I guess, last year that had enough data all in the end of the year. This is a really preliminary data. The higher the index number, so that's the number on the right, the better the bumblebee plant. We're simplifying a lot of things. We're going to get more sophisticated next year when we have more data. But if you look here, you can see that number one was cup plant. Then we have mountain mints, bergamot, goldenrod, clover, all on that high 20 plus level. Not a real big surprise. We would probably guess that, although a lot of people may not know what cup plant is, right? So we could recommend that in the future. And then we look down, and actually, interestingly, there's black-eyed Susan, but it's quite low. I'm pointing, you can't see that, obviously. 4.3 there is relatively low compared to those. So even though everyone plants black-eyed Susan for bumblebees, it's not super great for bumblebees, right? It's saying like, well, meh. And then if you go to brown-eyed Susan, it's like only 1.6, so really a whole lot lower. And we look here at some other things like dandelion is basically almost zero. So these all had to have been plants that showed up on 10 or more surveys. So it wasn't like dandelion was zero or almost zero because there was none around. It was just never chosen for bumblebees, at least in the fall, when it had all this other gorgeous stuff to eat. So so those are all interesting. And you know what? I think I forgot to grab the ones. There's a whole series of interesting plants that are zeros. Like, this is part of the survey, is like, what do you use and what don't you use? So we have a whole set of plants that are very commonly planted that unfortunately I neglected to put up here on my slide that never got any bumblebee traction. Anyway, I'm going to show this next slide. This is, oops, nope, did I miss it? Oh, darn it. You'll have to email me. I forgot the email slide too. Anyway, use my email address and I'll connect you. But we really want you to do these surveys. They're easy. They're just a half-hour walk. You choose where you want to go. We like your garden is super good for that. And any other park, you don't have to have a net. You just have to have a clipboard and a piece of paper. And we'll provide those. So now back to more general topics. When you go and buy pollinator mixes for your pollinators and plant them, a lot of times, you go to Home Depot or to Lowe's, you're going to get, or most garden supply places, those wildflower mixes or pollinator mixes, mostly they're non-native flowers. These are, again, bird feeder plants. It's, cheese whiz for everyone. There will be bees. It's not a bad thing, but we could do a whole lot better in planting a more biodiverse mix. So I'm downgrading that and saying you should go to your nurseries and get plugs and plants and plant those for really good, high quality native plants. So, and they often just have, even if they have some natives, it's not very many of them, right? So Maryland and Virginia have roughly 4,000 species of plants are known. About 80% are pollinated by insects. That's a lot more than the usual 20 species that show up even in the best of pollinator mixes. So you are in charge of diversity by going to your nearby native plant nurseries, or raising from seed, or transplanting, or swapping with your neighbors, and building back into the city, which is not bad habitat. And I can tell you that a story, most of you know Dyke Marsh there on the Potomac. Well, Dyke Marsh is basically a recovering piece of junk, right? It was a dump. You go in this entrance, it was just gigantic slabs of concrete. The marsh was mined for sand and gravel, and then the National Park Service got it and has been doing a great job on certain amounts of restoration, but it's certainly no Valhalla wilderness, superb biodiversity hotspot. Yet at the same time, because it is in the city and the Park Service has done some studies, we have found a whole bunch of super rare bees. So the bee on the upper right is Nomada electella, and that was so rare that no one had ever even seen a male of that species. Well, there was a whole bunch of males of that species there at the marsh, and there's only a handful of females ever collected. And the species at the bottom is another super rare bee called Calides ciliatus, and it turns out it's a daughter specialist. Who even thought of things going to daughter? Anyway, so again, they're not redlining. So if you plant in the area nearby Dyke Marsh, or the Great Falls, or the Parkway, or all these areas that the Park Service and other parks still maintain as natural areas, they're going to move into your neighborhood. And we have good examples, which I don't have time to give, and I'm wrapping up now, of bee lists within cities. For example, Sidwell Friends School, and a couple others that really show you planted and they will come. So how do you do that? So I mentioned in some of the conversations earlier, mulch is the way to go. First of all, you can get tons of chips through Chip Drop, and you want the hardwood chips. You just want to take your lawn, cut it down as low as possible. And we're actually doing this with weedy fields too, but we have some problems there with any perennial vine or woody plant will push through the mulch. So you either want to dig them or rototill them out initially, or to break them up, or you're just going to dig them out of the mulch because it'll be easier to do that way. And you want a good 8 inches. So 8 inches will repress all the grasses and little forbs, annual forbs in there, with the exception of Bermuda grass. Everyone, this is yet again, Bermuda grass is our enemy, but it will be easier to pull because it'll be much more obvious. And then what you do is you just bury the whole lawn. You bring in plugs or plants, and you make a little crater inside the mulch and dig down to the soil level, put your plant in there, and you don't cover it back up with mulch because obviously it would not be happy. You leave it there to grow, and then you can push the mulch back later. And this is like either the first or second year after we did this on an old septic tank field. And I'll show, I think, one more here. This is, you can see to the left, this is a gravel parking lot, right? So we didn't do anything more than dump a whole ton of mulch on it and plant right through it. And this is the second, it's either the first or the second year, I can't remember, on this one. So that mulch recreates the soil community that you want to have there, because it's tons of carbon, and carbon is the key to soil health. That soil needs it, and your invertebrates underneath, the bacteria and the fungi and other microbes, are going to pull that carbon in and create the soil nutrients. When the plants come in, they're going to be happy. They'll have their little microbes there to work with. No fertilizer, very little weeding, and you can just add a little chip each year, or a lot of times you can skip years. And as people probably know, over time, those perennials create their own community and basically shade everything out. So I believe, I just want to say, get rid of your lawnmower, just have a good weed whip, and you can get a gas powered one, not a oil, a mix one there, Makita, and that's shown here, but others do it too. So it's a 4-stroke. And I don't have a lawnmower, I have an acre, and I just make paths throughout that. This is my favorite tool. I just found this one this year. It's put out by Ames. I got mine at Tractor Supply, but they're all over the place. Really sharp end. It's just, you hold it in your hand, and it really allows you to cut right through that mulch and cut the roots off of whatever invasive plant is there. And it's great for getting out your aggression too. And I've actually never even broken one, which is amazing, because most of these are a piece of junk sometimes, you know, the weld is bad or whatever. I have not broken them. I have lost them because I lend them out too often. So I'm ending there. There's contact information. If you're interested in the bumblebee counting, helping us, we would love to have you participate wherever you are. We're all doing it throughout the whole Northeast. So all those people who are in farther away places, you can participate too. And we would love that, because we've been recruiting mostly from the DC area.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was great. I wrote down from both you and Celia some great quotes. I really like the idea of a charcuterie board of pollen producing plants. That's a really powerful image to have in your mind as you think about gardening come the spring. So we're going to jump right into the questions. Jocelyn wanted to know, as host plants change, blooming times because of climate, hold on, let me see if I understand this.
She's probably going about the disjunct between climate change pushing plants to blooming earlier and then the bees not getting the memo.
I think that's exactly right.
So it can be a problem. Right now, we just don't know enough about that. It's been documented to occur in the Rockies, where you have this long-term studies along vertical faces of mountains around here. Who knows? You know, eventually the bees will catch up or they'll be dead. So it's a pretty powerful motivation to not get enough food. So at this point, like, what do you do about it? I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that's, Sam had a good point. It's just, it's too early to know what the effects of climate change are. You know, I made mention to a study earlier on in my presentation about bumblebee ranges changing over time. And that study looked at museum specimens from North America and Europe over a span of 200 years. And that's how they were able to kind of see, oh, bumblebees are moving northward up. But we need more time, I think, to better understand what exactly is going to happen and how bees are going to respond.
Yeah. We just interestingly in the area, so Bombus vagans used to be all throughout DC. They collected it, of course, because bumblebees are easily collectible. And so we have the Smithsonian's collection. And over 100 years ago, that was around in the DC area. Now you have to go out past Frederick to pick up that species. Additionally, weird and differently, like you wouldn't expect this bee called Bombus fraternus, which is a southern plains bumblebee, was in the area, at least some, and now we haven't seen that for decades. It may have a different issue, who knows? Interesting.
Yeah, you're right about vagans, because I remember that's another one that in the Virginia Working Landscape surveys only really turns up close to Shenandoah National Park. As soon as you start creeping up in elevation, that's where we start seeing it. So yeah, it's kind of interesting to see that change.
So the next question is from John. John asks, is it better to replace grass with clover?
Celia.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that one. I think it depends on what you want out of the area. If you want to keep it in some sort of turf situation, you want to still be able to walk on it, play baseball, whatever. Sure, I think anything that is turf-like but is not fescue is better than fescue. It just has such little environmental benefit that clover is nice. Like Sam said early on, some bees will frequent it. I usually see honeybees and bumblebees predominantly on white clover. It is a legume. There's some nitrogen fixing qualities to it, so better for soil health than lawn. But if it's an area where you don't really care what happens to it and you're not using it in a certain way for an activity as you're playing with your dog, then you can consider planting natives and converting the whole thing. It depends on what you want to do with the area.
Yeah, if you're considering planting clover, you're definitely outside the box of most neighborhood expectations, which is one species of fescue, solid, unicolor thing. So clover is better than that, but it is also like, it's mixing it up. It's not like a beautiful sward. So if you're going with clover, you might as well go for more, or basically do what I do, which is not do anything, but I have almost no lawn left. And what lawn I have, I don't really care what grows there. I just cut it so that I make at least some presentation that the paths and the front of the house doesn't look like it's abandoned or anything. So if you go clover, it's a slippery slope to chaos. People are working on what you might plant that are native plants into those environments. And so I don't have a lot of details. There certainly are lots of good cover plants that are native, that are attractive to bees, but I'm not sure how much traffic they could handle. Clover can handle it though. But also not native, right? No clovers, except for a couple endangered weird ones, are native to the region.
Right.
Thank you. So we have about 8 minutes left, and I think we have maybe 8 more questions. So let's try to go quickly so we can get to everyone's. Josephina asked, how do nativars fare for bee conservation? Do nativars in general, are they as effective as native plants?
I'm just going to say, Mount Cuba, look up their site. They do a lot of this. If a person is starting to do the genetics and the breeding, pollen and nectar go, because that energy is getting put into more presentation, shorter stature, longer life, tougher plants, whatever, because nature's not doing evolution anymore, man is. So it's maybe okay the first couple generations, but ultimately it's going to tap out. So in general, you almost always want the straight species.
Okay, Celia, I'll let you take the next one. What are the most important plants for attracting native bees if you have room for only a few? And this one is from Joan.
Yeah, so that is kind of the tricky question, because I've thought about that many times. And the best answer I can put out is that you're going to want to think about plants that are very attractive to a lot of species, but then you also want some that are kind of the weird ones, like Sam was mentioning, that are different, you don't see a lot. So you kind of want both. And if you only have space for a very small, like a 10 by 10 square foot, pollinator garden, try and approach it that way. And like one that comes to mind, even though I cautioned against it in small spaces, is like mountain mint and goldenrod and aster. Those 3 genera of species are some of the most attractive flowers for attracting a diversity of insects. They're just like the party plants. Everybody is invited. And then, thinking about some of the more unique ones that may be on Sam's specialist bee list, picking and choosing. And, you might only need like 1 plant, if it's a small area. You don't necessarily need to have like 3 or something, kind of learn about what the habit and growth rate are of these species to see if they will work together in an environment. That's my best guess.
I call mountain mint BTV, and because it's 6 weeks of just bloom. They're all about chest height, and it's just everything's working it. And shout out to Brooke Alexander, who used to work at the lab, who I see in the chat room. Sorry, had to do a shout out.
All right, thanks. So John asked, should I leave my wood pile undisturbed?
So I'll say a couple things. One is, I mean, you have a wood pile, I think, because you burn wood, but if you have enough room, I have these branches came down and I just throw them in a pile. That is not bad. Also, if you have a hand drill, electric drill, just drill holes in that dead wood, in different angles, in different places, in different sizes. You don't have to buy fancy bee houses, and spreading them out spreads out the problem of packing too many things in one place and attracting parasites.
James asked if there are places we can go to plant besides our backyards.
Celia.
Like
Gorilla?
on their own property or public property?
I think that he heard one of you say something that it suggested that perhaps there were other places that people could go besides their own property to plant natives.
I mean, I think one good place for, once again, resources, if you're looking to volunteer or contribute to like a public pollinator garden, any sort of restoration work is going to be either your local soil and water conservation district, depending on where you are in Virginia or the other states. I know a lot of ours are kind of clearinghouse for kind of events like those, whether it's theirs or their partners. Also, the native plant campaigns. I know Nova Natives is always looking for volunteers to help with a variety of different things. And I'm sure that there's a lot of conservation organizations that would appreciate having some assistance with that kind of stuff.
Yeah, ditto.
Thanks. Okay, I think we have time for two more questions, and I see two I think are great to ask. Livona asked a really great curiosity question. How high do bees fly? The 10th floor of an apartment patio, the 23rd floor?
Oh, someone has studied that. So there's green roofs, right? So in Chicago, I can't remember the gal's name, but the answer was 16th floor. There you go.
16th floor?
I did not know that. Okay.
Okay, this will be the last question. What plant does the rusty-patched bumblebee specialize in? Would you consider adding a column to your bee table that includes some measure of how rare and in need of help they are?
That's an interesting idea. So Sam kind of touched on this before in his presentation. Bumblebees are tricky because they are considered generalists, in that they visit a lot of different flowers, but then they have like preferences within that suite of flower. And a lot of it depends on flower shape, color, time of year, things of that nature. And rusty patch, off the top of my head, research has shown that they're attracted to like St. John's wort, which is we have several species of St. John's wort in Virginia. Some of the native sunflowers, Sam talked about that. Aster, so some of the aster species. But what's interesting about the rusty patch bumblebee compared with the other bumblebee species, you guys are going to laugh at this, but a lot of what they forage on is dependent on their tongue length. So bees have different lengths of tongue. And even within bumblebees, there are long-tongued bumblebees and short-tongued bumblebees. And that helps them, drink nectar, things of that nature. Rusty patches have shorter tongue lengths. So they're going to be going for flowers that have shorter shapes like corollas, where, it's the little flute of the flower and they can just land on it. They also are nectar robbers, which means that they can chew holes in sides of these long fluted flowers and drink the nectar out that way. So just a little bit of rusty patch information, but there's a lot of things out there. I know that the Pollinator Partnership and Xerxes Society has some preferred species lists for rusty patch, but those are the ones I can remember off the top of my head.
We've been working in Appalachia with Mark Hepner, who's been doing surveys, and so this is mostly his observations that so first of all, they're very isolated. So rusty patches right now are in high mountain areas, isolated from pretty much everything, maybe not causal but they appear to be in the woods in the early spring. Okay, so they're foraging on all those spring wildflowers, things like mountain laurel and the spring ephemerals. And then when that system shuts down later in spring, they move to nearby very species rich wildflower areas. They're really not in suburbs down here. In upper Midwest they are, but down here they're really only in these mountain passes. And so along streams, wild hydrangea, along roads, you know, the usuals like Joe Pye weed and boneset and goldenrod, and the woodland sunflowers that are along there, but they don't go far. Something's about being near big fields, like they're not in the in Shenandoah Valley, for example. They're absent, but they're in these mountain passes. So it's a struggle to figure out what to do. So it's mostly maybe something to do with Forest Service and rural road management. And so that's the thinking from Mark mostly.
Interesting.
Thank you both. That's really fascinating. Once again, we want to thank you both, Celia and Sam, for giving awesome presentations. I learned a lot, and I hope that everyone who joined us tonight did as well. I think you both have provided your email addresses if people want to follow up with you with questions. I know we didn't have time to get to every single one, but we did have really fantastic inquiries. As one final note, I think Michelle is pulling it up. We just want to let you know that our annual meeting is coming up, and we'll have Terry Baker, the CEO of the Society of American Foresters, join us and talk about trees and tree equity. We're really excited about that. And thank you again to our sponsors. We really appreciate it. I also want to give a shout out to Michelle Bianchi, who's an Eco Action Arlington staff member who did tons of work behind the scene to bring this event to you all. And thanks as all to the planning committee and to our speakers tonight. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.